All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So hi, everyone, again. I'm Greta with VNRC and VECAN, and excited to be here with you all today to talk about complete streets. So I'm sure as many of you know, having registered for this webinar, complete streets is a policy mechanism that can support transportation diversification and help reduce Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions while creating a safer and more accessible transportation future for all of us. So you all as energy committee members and community leaders play a critical role in advancing community efforts like this because you know so well what your communities need and are strong advocates for how these changes can usher in improvements for the environment, for public health and safety, and for overall quality of life. So excited to have this conversation here with all of you today, learn together and hear what you're all working on as well, and how this sort of work is manifesting in your communities. So first, we're going to hear from Katie Gallagher of Vermont Natural Resources Council. At VNRC, Katie directs the Sustainable Communities Program, advocating for policies that support smart growth development and community planning for a resilient future for Vermont. She also leads the Small Grants for Smart Growth grant program at VNRC and coordinates Transportation for Vermonters, which is a diverse coalition of organizations, individuals, and businesses working together to achieve a sustainable and accessible transportation future. And then we're going to hear from Jonathan Weber. Jonathan is Local Motion's Senior Manager for their Complete Streets program. Local Motion's mission is to make it's safe, accessible, and fun for everyone to walk, bike, and roll in Vermont. And he supports communities in implementing complete streets policy and design customized for their individual community needs, and will be walking us through what this sort of policy implementation looks like at the community level. And after these presentations, we're hoping to have a good amount of time for Q&A and conversation with all of you, again, to hear what sort of work you're doing to implement complete street strategies in your community, challenges that you may be encountering, successes that you've had, and any creative ideas. So hoping folks can stick around. Definitely feel free to put questions in the chat throughout the presentations and use that to have good conversation. And then we'll be turning it over to all of us for Q&A and conversation at the end. So I am going to now turn it over to Katie to kick us off with the first presentation.
Great, thank you, Greta. And I want you pulling up slides. Thank you. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk about complete streets. It's one of my favorite topics, and I'm really glad that we're able to have Jonathan here also to talk about their programs, because complete streets is fun, and transportation isn't always fun, and it can be a little dry. And so I think this is one of my favorite opportunities to really engage community members in a collective process of building streets and communities that work for everyone. So first off, to give me a better sense of who I'm talking to here, I'm wondering if folks can raise their real life or virtual hands if you have ever tried to get a new bike lane or a sidewalk or crosswalk or new signage in your town. Few of you. Okay, awesome. That's helpful. I have, in my experience, it is really challenging to do so. And so we want to talk a bit about how to make it work in your town, and also the importance of trying to implement complete streets work in your town if you haven't had the chance to do so already, and give you some resources and ideas for how to make it a little bit easier. So I guess to give you a little bit of my background, as Greta said, I direct the Sustainable Communities program and do some other things. I coordinate transportation for Vermonters, but my background is as a planner. And so I've had the experience of working on the ground with communities and trying to do this work. And that's how I know it's fun. So let's dive into the next slide, please. So if anybody was at the VECAN webinar over the winter in December, you might recognize this slide from me. But the story here is that transportation, and more specifically complete streets, has a wide variety of benefits. So we're here talking about why you as energy committee members and members of your committee and advocating for the environment should care about transportation. And there's a whole host of reasons there. But there's also the fact that this is an issue about accessibility and affordability, especially as we move into a time when gas prices are going all over the place, and we have an aging population, and we have a lot of folks who are also interested in reducing their own personal vehicle use to address climate change, or to just get out of their car and be more active and healthy. So, you know, there's a common narrative in Vermont that we can't really do much about reducing driving because everybody needs a car in Vermont, right? Like, we're a rural state, we live far apart, it's really mountainous. So we all need cars, and that's where we should focus our transportation efforts. But I hope that you will join me in trying to bust that myth, as we not only try to address transportation as the greatest source of our greenhouse gas emissions in the state, but also, again, as a public health issue, safety, equity, affordability, all of these things are coming to play at this one point, which is making our streets safe and accessible for all users in order to get out of our cars. So that's what this slide is trying to get at. And just to kind of throw some numbers out, we don't have super great data in Vermont, but we know that about 2,000 Vermont households don't have a car. About 7% of Vermonters don't drive. That number is probably higher because it's also not really including unreliable access to vehicles. So, you know, what happens if you have one car, it breaks down, well, now you're out of luck, right? So there's that component of it, of not having any transportation options. We also have lots of folks who are under driving age, kids, right? They need to get places, and we shouldn't, I hope, have to drive them around everywhere. So how are we providing for safe streets for our children? Motor vehicle crashes are a leading cause of injury in Vermont. Over half of pedestrians killed in our roadways are over the age of 60. So this also doesn't have an equal impact across Vermonters. In terms of affordability, we know that almost 50% of our energy dollars are going towards transportation alone. So, you know, it's not necessarily realistic to expect that everybody can just jump out of their cars. But there are actions that we can take now to support those who cannot drive, who do not have reliable access to cars, or who choose not to drive. So we're going to hear from Jonathan again about how to do this more and the importance of complete streets, but wanted to kind of frame that up at the beginning. So next slide, please. Thank you. So to get in a little bit more to complete streets, and I think Jonathan's going to touch on this also, so I'm not going to go super into depth. Transportation planning, just to take a step back for a second with my planning hat on, transportation planning in general can be really broad. It can touch on a lot of different aspects, more technically related to road design and where we're putting streets and plowing. And there's, you know, if you're involved in the transportation world, you know that there's a lot there. Complete streets, part of the reason why we wanted to talk about it today is that it gets down to what often towns can more specifically control in their downtowns and village centers. So this is an approach to planning, as Greta was explaining at the beginning, It's an approach that focuses on designing and building streets that are safe and accessible for all users. So users thinking about pedestrians, people who are bicycling, motorists, transit users, but also, thinking about folks in wheelchairs or pushing a grocery cart or pushing a carriage. So it also really emphasizes the needs of those who have experienced systemic underinvestment, or those who, their needs have not really been met through the traditional transportation approach. And again, there are still, even though we sometimes don't recognize them, those folks do exist all across the state. But again, recognizing that we are a rural state, oftentimes our approach to complete streets is focused more so on our downtowns, village centers, those places where mixed use compact development allows for and enables this type of non-vehicle mobility. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight just one challenge to complete streets, which is that it often can disrupt the current transportation system that has been built to efficiently move vehicles and not people. And in fact, these two issues, speed and safety, are generally not compatible. And so, I just kind of want to put a plug in for, while we're going to be talking about relatively simple concepts or actions that we can take, ultimately, there's still a lot of people who like driving in their cars and they want to get to where they're going fast. And that's the way that we have been funding transportation, thinking about transportation, learning about transportation as engineers and designers and so on. So we are making a pretty significant shift. And it's imperative that local decision makers are also on board with making that shift at the local level. Next slide, please. So in 2011, Vermont passed our Complete Streets legislation, Act 34. It requires the Agency of Transportation and municipalities to consider the needs of all users in transportation projects. There are some exemptions, so unpaved roads, places like highways where walkers and bikers aren't actually allowed to be in those places. Those do not have to follow Complete Streets principles. In 2021, I think about half of VTrans projects were considered to be exempt from Complete Streets. But we also know that there's certain challenges and how these get implemented on the ground, which again, if folks have had the experience of trying to get a bike lane or a sidewalk or something like that in your town, you have some experience in knowing what these challenges are. But this slide, I wanted to highlight also that there is no one size fits all approach to Complete Streets. It is purposefully context sensitive. So to determine what facilities and accommodations are most appropriate, it's really dependent on where you are. So on the left-hand side of the slide here, we have my town of Waterbury, which just underwent a very significant Main Street reconstruction project. But this is an area where we're going to have lots of different potential users, walkers, bikers going to the mountain bike trail right off of downtown. We're going to consider where they're coming and going to, all of those different factors to make the decisions that are right for our downtown here. On the other hand, we have a more rural context, like here in Cornwall on the right, which was a paved road that saw a lot of walkers, but there was no shoulder. But this is not really a place where it makes sense to have a sidewalk going along this type of street. And so in this example, we're just adding a shoulder to the road in order to make it a little bit safer for walkers and bikers. Next slide, please. So I also just wanted to point out that it's often necessary for towns to do planning work and community engagement work prior to VTrans coming in, if they are the one that owns your roads that you're looking at implementing complete streets. They have projects in the works generally years in advance. If it's a bigger project like updating a bridge or repaving the main street, things like that, which are really great opportunities to take that time to say, okay, well, let's expand the road a little bit so that we can add a bike lane, or let's narrow the road a little bit and add bump outs and crosswalks. But if VTrans doesn't have in their budget and their planning the fact that your town has done the work to know where these improvements should be done, it is likely that they're not going to incorporate it into that work. And unfortunately, that often becomes a lost opportunity to implement complete streets into your town through that process. So just something to be thinking about, that you can't start too early to start working with your planning commission and your select board members and others as to how you can start the process of implementing a complete streets approach into your town. Many city councils, select boards have adopted resolutions to set guiding principles, or created internal policies, or updated the comprehensive plan, or done a separate planning process for walking and biking. All of those things are really helpful to get the gears in motion. There's also other kind of creative solutions that different towns have done with more volunteer-based groups. So we can certainly talk about that as well. I have a resources page also that includes the Complete Streets Guide, which is a little outdated now, but it provides a really great resources for going more in depth for starting this process and considerations that your town would want to think about. Next slide, please. So before I hand it over to Jonathan, I wanted to briefly talk about some policy goals. So as Greta mentioned at the beginning, I coordinate Transportation for Vermonters, which is a broad cross-sector advocacy organization that Jonathan is also a part of. And we work to create a sustainable and equitable transportation system for Vermont. So as you can see, these are our current membership at the bottom. We have folks who are representing AARP, the Center for Independent Living, environmental organizations, transit service providers. So we're trying to, again, bring together that idea that by providing a sustainable transportation system and network that has multiple options for all different needs, we can achieve our environmental goals, our equity goals, our affordability goals, and so on. So related to complete streets, I wanted to share these 4 points. The first is funding, and funding is always the big question. We have several different funding sources. Again, I listed some of them on the resources page that we'll share. But one I wanted to call out is the Mobility and Transportation Innovation Grants, or the MTI grants, which have been available for several years. The Climate Action Plan calls for an investment of $10 million into this program, which can help with everything from supporting employers to implement transportation demand management plans or ways to help their employees figure out different ways to get around. It can help towns with technical support and assessing the feasibility of a bike lane. So they can be really helpful in a variety of ways. I think in the past fiscal year, there was about $1.5 million allocated to this program. So there's a lot more need there that we can be funding. The second bullet here is updating the Vermont state standards, which is a bit of a wonky engineering guidance document. This is basically what the Agency of Transportation engineers, designers, their technical folks are using to design and build our streets and roads. And so this is super important when we're thinking about complete streets, because that's how these get built. Unfortunately, the standards haven't been updated since they were created in the mid-90s, but VTrans is currently undergoing a process right now to establish a budget to update the standards, and then we're expecting this to be about a 2-year process. So the work of our coalition is to ensure that that work happens and happens well, and engages stakeholders across the state to make sure that we have the best product possible. The third one is improving the Complete Streets state statute. So that's Act 34 that I shared earlier. We're not working on a statute change necessarily this year, but we think that it's important to set the stage for future policy work, particularly to add more teeth to that legislation that it doesn't really currently have. I kind of alluded to it earlier, but there's a lot of room to make complete streets the norm whenever a VTrans project is undergoing. We shouldn't always have to wait for towns to have done that work 5 years ago for it to maybe be implemented, and all of those different factors that are currently kind of getting in the way. And then finally, I just wanted to mention again, kind of thinking more broadly about transportation planning. Transportation is essentially land use, and of course, how we use our land is, impacts where we live, how much we have to drive to get to where we live or to where we work or drop our kids off at school. So that is what gets into that 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And so smart growth generally, supporting development in our existing downtowns and village centers is really critical to make sure that we are able to invest in the things that we want, like bike lanes, walking, transit, and that we have the population density that we're currently lacking to make those things feasible. So I will leave it there and pass it over to Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Katie. That was an excellent intro. I hope I can follow it up with some helpful information for you all that sort of augments what Katie offered. So my name is Jonathan Weber. I'm the Complete Streets Program Manager at Local Motion. And as I think Greta said, our mission is to make it safe, accessible, and fun for everyone to bike, walk, and roll in Vermont. And we do that through a bunch of different programs that sort of span from education for kids who are, in elementary and middle schools to help them learn how to bike safely, to similar programs for adults. We do a lot to promote e-bikes. And through the Complete Streets program, we seek to help communities improve their infrastructure and policies for walking and biking. And next slide. You can skip past this one too, because we covered it. So this work is really rooted in equity, right? Like someone could say right now, our transportation system is it's very equal, right? Everyone's got the same opportunity to go out on our streets, but of course our streets don't really serve everyone the way that they need to. So our work is about making sure that everyone can get around in their communities and in the state by their chosen modes. And for us, that really means ensuring that walking and biking and rolling, using an assistive device are all safe and comfortable things to do. Next slide. Katie talked about some of this, why we do this work. It really runs the gamut from, physical, addressing diseases of inactivity and traffic violence. Social, I think, is hugely important and often overlooked, right? Communities where people are out walking around and biking are places where people can stop and talk to each other and have those interactions that really make our communities what they are, right? Our places ultimately are the sum of the interactions between people, I think. So that's hugely important. Economic, also sometimes overlooked, right? If you're not getting in your car, you're much more likely to spend money in the businesses that are closest to you. And so if you're in a downtown or a village center, especially, that usually means a locally owned business. And at the same time, when we look at the big box stores and the strip mall areas, those are places that are built for cars. They're not built for walking and biking. And when we build for walking and biking, we really benefit our local businesses. And of course, environmental, a huge amount of our emissions in the state are from our transportation sector. And we don't have to totally eliminate driving, but if we can move some number of trips to walking and biking, especially those shorter distance trips under 5 miles, which make up a really significant percentage of the trips we take as Vermonters, that can make a huge difference to our emissions and help us along the way. Next slide. So, there are a lot of different motivations for this work. I'm going to talk a lot about safety, and that's because really one of the biggest barriers that we have control over is the level of safety out on our streets. And right now, as is shown in this picture, which is Isle Lamont, our streets are not safe generally for people walking, for people using wheelchairs and assistive devices. They're not especially safe even for people driving. Countries that have really done more work on their infrastructure than we have in the United States have much safer conditions for driving and also much higher levels of satisfaction among drivers. The Netherlands, which is of course thought of as the utopia for walking and biking, it turns out it's also a utopia for driving. Drivers have some of the highest reported satisfaction rates of anywhere, much higher than drivers in the US in the Netherlands. So of course, people using transit are also usually walking or using an assistive device or a bike on one side of their transit trip. So even if the bus trip itself is safe for them, often once they get off the bus, the infrastructure is not safe. And of course, for people biking. Next slide. So when we talk about safety, I think it's helpful to start with some fundamentals, because we've gotten kind of mixed up about how to achieve safety in our transportation system for the past few decades. And it's resulted in a lot of deaths on our roadways, and it's really tragic. So right now, nationally, we're sort of in a time of reset and refocusing our efforts around safety. And so it's important to talk about a basic understanding behind that effort. And the first thing we have to acknowledge is a couple of inherent characteristics about humans, right? Our bodies are vulnerable, right? We don't do well in a crash with a car, even if we are in a car ourselves, but especially if we are not. And we make mistakes, right? We're not perfect. Even the driver who has, the most training, they could be a race car driver. Like, in the top 1% of drivers, they're still going to make some mistakes. And when they make a mistake, they're putting themselves as a vulnerable human and the people around them as vulnerable humans in danger. So our challenge is to design a transportation system that is safe for vulnerable humans and acknowledges that humans make mistakes and is still safe when they do. Next slide. So what creates the hazard for humans, right? Still fundamentals here. It's about force, right? If there's no force, then generally you don't have a hazard. And force is the product of mass and acceleration. In the case of our roadways, the vast majority of the time, the mass is a car and the acceleration is the movement of the car. You can come up with crazy scenarios in which a person on a bike runs into a person walking. It happens, but it's extremely rare. The vast, 99-something% of fatalities and injuries that happen on our roadways involve cars. Next slide. And as Katie got at, speed is deadly. These are pedestrian injuries that impact speeds. You can see, at 20 miles an hour, the fatality rate is very, very low. But as speeds go up, fatality and injury rates climb really rapidly, even at 40 miles an hour. Next slide. So what do we do about it, right? What we understand these fundamentals, why we're vulnerable, that we make mistakes. We understand, that cars are basically the danger to humans out on the roads and the speed of the cars. One way to think about it is through this hierarchy of controls. And this is sort of a repurposing of how OSHA thinks about workplace safety and making an environment safe for humans. And so this upside down pyramid starts with the most effective types of countermeasures, things that we can do to make an environment safe for humans. And it goes down to the least effective types at the bottom. So at the top, you've got elimination, right? That would be totally removing cars from the situation, which would make streets very safe for people. That's pretty hard to do, right? In the short term, we're not going to pedestrianize all of our streets. Bike paths are an example of infrastructure where the threat has basically been eliminated. But these things take time. It's relatively hard to achieve elimination. Substitution is something that is possible, right? Moving people to transit so that there are fewer cars out on the roads. Having lighter or lower cars, that reduces the mass element of the equation or changes how a car strikes a person. One of the things we're seeing is really higher rates of fatalities due to the design of cars. So SUVs are heavier and they also strike a person higher on the body. So substituting those vehicles for smaller vehicles with better design would help. Again, something that's relatively difficult to achieve at the local and even the state level. A lot of that has to do with federal regulation. Engineering controls are very effective, and there's something we have a lot of control over at the state and local level. And that's basically, changing how the environment is built to essentially separate or protect humans from the threat. So that can look like a separated bike lane, ensuring that streets have a curved sidewalk so that people walking have a safe place to be with some level of protection from cars. And also designing for reduced speeds. So reducing the speed of cars, which are the threat on roads. Getting into the less effective controls here, which we also can do at the local level. Behavior change, which is really through like policy and education, right? Something like, requiring, people on bikes to go through some amount of training, right? That's something we could do. Local motion does a lot of education, so I don't think it's something we need to regulate, but that's an example of an administrative control. And then finally, at the lowest end of this is PPE, and which we're all familiar with these days, which is, in this case, something like helmets for people on bikes or reflective gear to make people more visible. So those are the less effective things, but they're things we often spend a lot of time talking about. And so there's a need to shift the conversation towards the more effective stuff. Next. So I'm going to talk now about what local motion does to support communities in making these changes and achieving these policy and infrastructure improvements. We're a statewide organization. Our Complete Streets team is a staff of two, myself and my coworker Susan. So we can't be everywhere. We can't go to every public meeting as much as we might like to. So it's really about supporting folks at the local level so that your capacity is increased and you can make change in your community with some assistance. It is a customized approach for each community. I wish there was a 10-step program for this stuff. Unfortunately, there's not. It really depends on your local context and how your place is built, what the culture there is like, maybe what planning has already happened for walking and biking. But what we can do is really meet with you, work with you, get a sense for your community, and help you figure out sort of what your next best steps are for improving conditions for walking and biking. Next slide. So it's sort of a range of things that we can do to support local groups, and that local group could be a walk bike committee that's specifically focused on this topic, or it could also certainly be an energy committee. I've worked with a couple of energy committees over the years, and I would love to work with more. I think there's a lot of overlap here in the work. One of the things we do is planning input. If you want to make improvements to our transportation system, the planning world is something that you're going to have to learn to deal with, and we can help you sort of understand how this stuff works, what your best next steps might be. Find out if there are already plans for roads in your community, and maybe help you think about how you might prioritize and implement those. And we can also support, your proposals. If you want to get a planning process going, if you want to apply for a grant, that's something we can often help with. Next up. Sorry, I gave Greta a hard job with a PDF. It's easier with the Microsoft Word, but that's not what I gave you. So sorry about that. So design review, when you get into a project and you've gone through the planning process, oftentimes you get to a point where you're getting into the nitty-gritty of it and looking at how the road's going to be designed, and things like how wide the lanes are going to be for cars. Are they going to be 10 feet? Or are they going to be 12 feet, 14 feet? These are things that make a huge difference to how the road feels and how safe it is. And so we can help you out by reviewing the designs and applying, our technical knowledge and our experience to improve them for walking and biking. Next up. One thing that that can be helpful in a community, especially kind of a mid-sized community that's just starting to go down this journey of improving conditions for walking and biking. A community walk bike survey can be a really great way to just get started, get sort of your name out there as a group, start to get some conversation going in the community. Get a sense of, what are the barriers out there? Like, what are the roads? What are the segments of roads that feel really scary? What are the intersections where people struggle? Talk about some of those barriers and maybe some of the things that the community might support to address those barriers to make it safer for walking and biking. And then the data that you get out of this often is a really strong show of baseline support for walk bike projects in the community. So it can be a great way to get things going and move this work forward. Next. Walk bike policy is also a really important thing. A lot of talk about building more housing, developing village centers and downtowns more. And if we're going to be doing that, we really want to make sure that those places are built well for walking and biking. And for biking specifically, that really means ensuring that those places have bike parking. So adding bike parking requirements to development ordinances is a great idea. It's something that you really can't do it too early, because once a project is underway, you've kind of missed that opportunity. So that's something we can help with. Looking at walk bike friendly traffic laws for your community. As an example, Burlington recently passed an ordinance allowing people on bikes to cross intersections on a pedestrian walk signal, which just sort of reinforces a behavior that most people will do already, allows people on bikes to get out in front of cars, which is safe. So we can look at those kinds of policies in your community and talk about if that would be a priority for you. Local complete streets ordinances are also something we could look at. We do have a state law that applies to communities, but if a community wanted to adopt a law or an ordinance that was maybe more ambitious than the state's law, which is not all that ambitious, that could certainly be something we could talk about. Next. So pop-up projects, these, maybe you've seen photos of these. These are a lot of fun. Katie talked a little bit about fun. These are maybe the most fun part of the work. And this is where you get to go out in your community and work with us to use, paint and duct tape and cones and reconfigure the road to make it safer for walking and biking. And in an afternoon, you can totally reconfigure an intersection or a street. And it's a great way to show the community, what could be and what it could feel like. And I also like to talk about how it's in a lot of ways a more equitable form of engagement than asking people to come to a public meeting, because you're giving them something that they can experience directly in their life, rather than saying, come, look at this screen, trying to comprehend our designs and what we're talking about in our jargon. This is really direct, and people often really like what we demonstrate. So this is a great thing to do It's something we can certainly talk about with you as well. Next. A walk bike action plan or a walk audit is a great way to go through your community. And you know, in the case of a walk audit, you're choosing like a street to walk down as a group, and you know, you're often bringing in municipal officials, maybe folks from the police and fire department, your public works department, maybe your local public health folks, and you're talking through, you know, what's going on the street and what are the challenges for walking or for biking or for both, and coming up with ways to address this. And at the end, you know, you are left with a really nice report often that gives you great action steps for how to improve whatever area you're looking at. Next up. We can really provide a range of sort of design assistance, specifically with bike parking. You know, we can provide a lot of help with actually giving you, you know, if your town needs to add bike parking in a park or at a municipal building, we can look at, you know, an existing area and say, you know, we think a rack would fit here, or you've got some extra concrete right here, you could just screw a rack down immediately, or here's where a concrete pad could be added to facilitate a new rack. And we can also facilitate purchasing through a vendor. Next. So this is actually not part of our Complete Streets program, but something I work on quite a bit, is our e-bike lending libraries. Some of you hopefully have heard about this program. I think e-bikes are just a fantastic solution for rural communities where it doesn't feel all that reasonable to expect people maybe to bike on a daily basis for transportation. But once you add that little bit of assistance from a battery and a motor, you know, that 5 mile trip, that 3 mile trip feels really very reasonable and is a lot of fun, and you don't get to where you're going covered in sweat, and you get there with a smile on your face and feeling way better than you would if you were in your car. So we're doing a lot to promote e-bikes. Our e-bike lending libraries basically travel around the state, and local communities host them as a way to provide residents with a multi-day loan. So you check out an e-bike, you take it home, you get to try it for, you know, generally anywhere between 2 to 5 days. And really get to see how it would fit in with your life and if you could change up your transportation routine. So if you're interested in hosting an e-bike lending library, you can reach out to me or to the email on the screen. And I think we're also going to have a page maybe on the VECAN website, and we'll include a link there as well. So I think that's the last slide, and really looking forward to chatting with you all some more.
Thanks so much, Katie and Jonathan, for those awesome presentations. And yes, we're definitely going to have a resource page on the VECAN website after today with the recording of these presentations and all the resources that have been mentioned, and probably likely some more. So I'm just looking at the chat now, not seeing a ton of questions yet. So maybe if anybody has some initial thoughts or questions, great. Patty, do you want to unmute and
Yes, I want to unmute. I just want to say I'm from Essex, and now our daughter, you know, obviously doesn't live with us. She's in South Burlington, but she used to work at Dealer, and you know that's all millennials. Okay, millennials work at dealer.com for 7 years. She worked there. And so I got a lot of feedback from her, and she said that a group of millennials back in 2014 went to VTrans and talked about, you know, what they want, public transit, they want housing along public transportation. I mean, along, like, say, I live in Essex, so Route 15 is controlled by VTrans. And VTrans will never allow Route 15, which is where we could build housing, you know, congregate housing, you know, and we could build bike shops and coffee shops and make a walkable community. But because of VTrans back in 2014, even though these millennials went to the board begging, literally, they all left. They left Vermont because they can't go on their app, get a little bus, or live. They don't mind living in a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex. And we need to build more housing. So is there a way that your organization works with transportation and housing together? Because we've lost a lot of millennials. And I think that without their funding, they're worth $1 trillion. Millennials work from home. My daughter happens to have an MBA. They leave Vermont, and it's because they run into a problem with VTrans, and they care about the environment, and they care about what can we do in our community, because they care about, even if they have a car. My daughter has a car, but she'd much rather get on her bike or use public transportation, because she, like many of her friends at dealer, care about the environment. So they end up moving to Atlanta or Colorado Springs or wherever to live on a transit line where there's a bike path, because they don't have VTrans. So my question is, how do our millennials deal with VTrans if for 10 years they've gotten nowhere? That's my question.
Thanks, Patty. I think that's a great question, and I definitely can relate to that. And I'm going to speak first to the question about transportation and housing. But Jonathan, I'm wondering if you also want to talk about Class 1 town highways and that the whole process. You are absolutely right. And housing and transportation, as I said before, transportation planning is land use. Housing is also land use. And so to the extent that that energy committees can be coordinating with planning commissions and other town volunteer groups, city council, select boards, to get us on the same page about the need for generally the way that we think about it is smart growth, right? So how do we support our existing communities? We're very lucky in Vermont that we already have this historic settlement pattern of compact village centers surrounded by our rural countryside, where we've been able to protect our natural resources. Unfortunately, we have continued to build out and out and out. One way that we are able to address that, and that we're looking to address that at the moment through this current legislative session on the housing side, but again, it all relates back to land use and transportation, is trying to work with towns to actually allow denser housing. Right now, a lot of towns, it's not even allowed to build like a duplex or to put on an accessory apartment at the back of your house. Or to turn a single family home into a multi-family home. So there's a lot of steps that we can be taking. Again, it's not about turning every town into Burlington or, but we need that kind of density, one, to have the affordable housing for all Vermonters. And as you mentioned, it's not just about low income housing, but about providing housing options that younger people want and are actively seeking out, because it's less to pay for and manage, but it's also in these walkable communities where you don't have to rely on a car. And it's what a lot of older folks who are looking to downsize out of single family homes are searching for. And there have been stories in the news recently about folks who want to downsize in Vermont, but like are stuck in their homes because they can't find other places to move into. So these two issues are very closely tied together. It's a lot of my personal focus, but I'd also call out Vital Communities as another organization that does a lot of work at that intersection of housing and transportation. And I just wanted to throw it over to Jonathan to talk about Class 1 town highways, which is getting at the question of VTrans and how we engage with them in relation to the ownership of our streets and how we can make progress.
Yeah, thanks, Katie, and thanks for an excellent question. It kind of gets at the core of where we are right now. And I totally agree. I mean, land use and transportation they're totally intertwined. You can't address one without addressing the other. You know, just as an example, right, our historic downtowns and village centers were built, you know, before people owned cars for the most part. And, you know, to have that form, you really can't have the rate of car ownership that we have. You just can't, you can't store all of those cars and have a dense place. It doesn't, there are physics that say otherwise, right? So we need to move people to other modes, and we need to build places that encourage other modes. And yeah, there are policies that can work at the land use level in terms of, you know, zoning reform, and especially removing parking minimums is a great thing. South Burlington has done that. Burlington has done that. Super important policy change. As far as class 1 is concerned, some of you may be familiar with this. So lots of communities in the state are located on a state highway that is owned and managed and maintained by VTrans. And VTrans, you know, has pretty stringent, you know, basically restrictions on what those communities can do on the state highway. I'm more familiar with, you know, sort of the design side of it rather than the development side. But even just on the design side, you know, they require a pretty wide clearance, basically from one curb to the other, and that's very restricting in terms of, you know, whether or not you have space to build sidewalks, and whether or not you can narrow the road enough to slow cars down, if you can have a crosswalk or stop signs, all of that stuff. So it makes it very hard for a lot of places to make their village feel like a place where people want to stop and spend time, because due to VTrans's restrictions, it really feels like a highway. So, you know, we've been working with Katie and other partners to try and address this. And, you know, VTrans has an option for communities to convert their segment of state highway to, you know, sort of more town management, which gives more flexibility. But it's very expensive. It's not realistic for most communities to do that. And so we've been working with VTrans for a long time, and a lot of RPCs have been trying to push VTrans on this as well, to lower that bar and have more flexibility. Hopefully the state standards update that Katie mentioned is going to be an opportunity to address that and maybe have some separate standards for village centers on state highways. We've also talked to them about options that, you know, could be a more short-term fix, like having their plow drivers drive through with their plow blades up and establishing a plowing agreement with the town, because believe it or not, that restriction on the width of the road is actually due to the dimensions of VTrans's plow blades. So it's something we're really trying to address. And VTrans is slow to change, but I think we're hopefully making some progress.
Awesome. Thank you both. And thanks, Patty, for the good question. Chuck, do you want to unmute and ask a question or share?
Thank you. Yeah. Chuck Fenton down in Heartland. I have a question about signalizing of crosswalks and biking, possibly bike crossing. I live in a rural community where there's a very few crosswalks, but they were built years ago. They're unsignaled. And I've read data recently that shows that fewer than 25% of drivers yield to pedestrians, even at crosswalks, when there's no signaling at all. So my question is, if you folks can offer any data or helpful resources to encourage our planners and managers here to adopt signaling, especially for crosswalks and possibly for bike paths where they cross a highway, because personally I believe that to wake drivers up, we need some form of signaling. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I can answer that one. So yeah, absolutely. Improving compliance at crosswalks is really important. There is a device called a rapid rectangular flashing beacon, an RRFB, which you've probably seen in some places there. It's sort of a post-mounted sign with a button on it that you can press, and when you press the button, you get flashing LED lights on both sides of the roadway at the crosswalk. And those make a huge difference for yield rates. There are some less expensive things that are not as well studied in terms of how effective they are, but RFPs are in the $10,000 to $15,000 range, so they're you can imagine a town buying them. They can't be placed at an intersection. They're really only for mid-block crossings. So if you're at a signalized intersection, that's a little more complicated. But absolutely, I'd be happy to provide some resources on that.
Great. Anyone? Oh, go ahead, Katie.
Sorry, just wanted to add on because I have worked in Waitsfield previously, where this was an issue that got brought up after a pedestrian fatality. And one of the things, I think this might have been what introduced me to Jonathan several years ago, but we were looking for different opportunities for making crossings safer. And we were able to work with Local Motion to do a pilot project where to take a first step towards potential rapid rectangular flashing beacon lights, which are fairly expensive. We did a pilot with an in crosswalk sign. So this is one of those mobile, you could either have them mobile or have them anchored into the street. But that's a much lower cost option for towns to try that out. We also paired that with a pre and post survey to see how community members felt safety wise before and after putting those signs in. And then that led us down the road into figuring out, okay, where do people feel the least safe, and where would an investment in a light be most appropriate given different crosswalks through the town.
All right, well, it is 1 o'clock, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Maybe we have one last question in the chat from Anne. And I don't know if you wanted to unmute and share anything, but it sounds like there's some concern about widening bike lanes in the roadway without dipping into people's private property, and maybe some examples of how to do that on a highway.
I think you just said it, Greta.
Okay.
Thank you. I mean, we want it all. We want to have good traffic that flows at a slow pace, pedestrian and bike lanes, so that the people who live in the village can walk around. But maybe that's not all. Maybe all that is just not possible in some towns. So some examples would be wonderful.
Jonathan, you want to take it?
Okay. Yeah, it's a little hard to speak to without sort of knowing exactly the context. I will say, if it's a state highway, part of what you may be dealing with is, VTrans's sort of curb to curb restriction. And if we can figure out a way to address that, you may be able to go a little narrower with the car lanes and have enough room for sidewalks without taking people's front yards. There are situations where there's no other option than taking yard, and in that case it's really a community conversation around what the priorities are. There are also you can look at traffic calming methods to without adding a sidewalk to just slow down the speed of the roadway without having much change to the width of it. So that could be an interim or an alternative.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I also just wanted to call out that Andy had made a comment in the chat about issues regarding winter maintenance and concerns from Public Works making these changes tough. And I think Jonathan could probably speak more to that, but that's certainly an issue that gets brought up commonly in towns, both from the town level. For example, sidewalks generally need to be managed by towns. And so, VTrans isn't going to come in and put a sidewalk in your town if the town isn't interested or isn't able to maintain it. At the same time, it's, we don't really want a bunch of sidewalks that are totally falling apart and the town isn't able to manage it. So that there is a question mark there about how that works out in terms of sharing the load of maintenance and responsibility. Jonathan, I don't know if there's really an answer or a helpful piece of information there.
Yeah, well, I think that, especially with winter maintenance, there are sort of two variations of this. There's the genuine capacity challenge that some towns have, but then there's also a challenge around, drivers or public works departments not wanting to learn to plow around something like a curb extension. And that should not be something that residents accept. Curb extensions are used across the nation, across Vermont, in lots of communities, and plow drivers plow around them quite capably in lots of places. The other aspect of the maintenance beyond, winter maintenance and just sort of the capacity thing, it does in a lot of ways get back to that land use question and, the need to have denser communities that are able to, muster more financial resources to support the infrastructure that residents want, right? We have a lot of support right now coming from the state and the federal government. That's sort of a historical exception. Historically, communities have really built themselves, and that capacity for a community to build itself comes from density. So we really need to sort of get back to that.
All right. Well, thank you to Katie and Jonathan again, and for all of you for joining us here today. Excited to continue this conversation and hoping to see many of you at the next few workshops that we're going to be having in the VECAN series. It's going to be every other Wednesday at noon, and it will probably just carry on indefinitely. It's a winter workshop series, but we'll just keep doing it all the way into the spring. So hopefully to see many of you again soon. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your week, everyone.
Thank you all.